company. So today we're going to be talking about ESOP. And ESOP is super important because every single major tech company I can think of that was able to grow exponentially has used this tool to be able to bring exceptional talent on board. So as a founder of a startup, you're starting off, you have limited resources, and you're constantly struggling with what's the best way I can attract talent? What's the best thing I can think of? Can I think of an attractive schedule? Should I allow them to work from home? How can I make this a really cool, unique value proposition to bring everyone on board? And ESOP is going to be your solution in this case. So we're going to start talking about what employee stock option schemes actually are. So it's an allocation of shares that will be granted to employees in the future in the form of stock options. Now, you might be thinking here, me as a founder, what will be my incentive to give stock to employees in my company? Why would I want to do that? So first, let us explain the concept of stock real quickly. When a business is starting off, you have a number of founders that come together with an amazing idea that they want to bring to life. The very first thing they want to do is put together what we call a founders agreement. In this founders agreement, they're going to agree on what the business is, who the founders are, their roles, their responsibilities, and how the shares are going to be allocated in this company they're going to create. Once they've done that, they register this company, and this company becomes a business entity, a person on its own. This company is going to be formed of shares or stock. We call them shares or stock depending on the jurisdiction in which the company is operating. So it's an allocation of these shares that will be granted to employees in the form of stock options. We're going to start with a quick distinction between ESOP and long-term incentive plans. The terms are used interchangeably sometimes, but we're going to try to break them apart. And the whole purpose of this exercise is to really find out which one works best for you. So a long-term incentive plan is a company policy that will reward employees for reaching specific goals that will lead to increased shareholder value. We're going to be using the term employees in this session just to simplify things and keep them straightforward and, straight to the point. But just keep in mind that ESOP is sometimes granted to advisors, certain contractors, although that's a little bit more exceptional. So we're basically going to be talking about this pool that you're reserving for your special talent. The first reason to adopt long-term incentive plans or ESOP is going to be to align the interest of the shareholders with the interests of the employees. And that's basically the main reason you're doing this. So you want everyone who's working on board, who's working on you on this project to really feel like their success is going to be not only instrumental to your company, but also that the two are very much linked together. So you're kind of going to want to think about it as bringing together the fate of the company along with that related to the success of the employees. And that's the main reason why a lot of companies adopt these terms and adopt these plans. So you want to incentivize, whether you're incentivizing your existing employees and you want to keep them on board and you want to keep them engaged and you want them to really contribute to your success, or even if you just want to attract talent and be able to create this attractive package that is going to be formed of some form of monetary compensation, but also these stocks that they can hold for the future. So as you can see here, we're talking about long-term incentive plans. The idea is to reward employees. And I'm going to say that the key word here is going to be reward, because here you're really going to want to thank them. You're going to reward them for the hard work that they're going to be doing. Startups are a lot of work. So there's a lot of sacrifice. There are a lot of maybe extra hours that are going to go into it. So you really want to make it worth their while. So long-term incentive plan is just a generic term that is used to describe an employee incentive arrangement where performance is measured over a period of time, usually over a one-year period. Throughout this session, we're going to be using different terms that are a little bit technical. We're going to try to simplify it as much as possible. So the same way we did with stock, we're going to be talking about a concept called share vesting, which you may have heard of before. We're going to be talking about this distinction between different classes of shares. And we're going to be breaking all of this down. We're going to try to do it as much as possible during this session. Whenever it's not possible, we're going to dedicate another session to it. And you can always join the Lexyom Academy to learn more about these concepts. So as we mentioned, the main reason to adopt long-term incentive plans is to align the financial interests of senior employees with that of shareholders. Common features that we find across the board is that these are plans that are reserved for senior employees in the company. So we typically find these plans a little bit more exclusive. You really want to reward either a CTO in your company, somebody who's working on the technical side, who's adding a lot of value, maybe your key sales personnel. So you want to think about these senior employees and even the initial employees that joined the startup early on. They are thought of as free shares or cash, and we're going to explain this a little bit more. And it only pays off once conditions are achieved. They are measured over a period of 3 years, and there are usually clawback provisions that are going to be added. Now, just a quick note here, we find different types of ESOP and different types of plans. We find phantom stock options, we have plain vanilla options. For the purpose of this session, we're going to focus mostly on the plain vanilla option just to keep things a little bit simple. The phantom option is basically an option where you have rewards that mimic the activity of a stock. So even though you're not going to be granting your employees shares straight on, you're going to give them the benefits and the advantages that derive from those shares. These can be a very interesting tool for founders that, either are in a jurisdiction where they find things a little bit complicated for them. They don't want to bother with the administrative load of basically having to create stock and distribute stock. And we're going to break down the steps to be able to do that. So these are options that usually expire within a 10-year period if they're not exercised, or within 3 months after the employee is leaving the company. Now to dig deep into the subject that we're going to be talking mostly about, which is going to be ESOP. First of all, let me tell you that there are different types and different classes of shares in a company. When we talk about types of shares and classes of shares or stock, we're talking about the different rights and obligations that are attributed to these stocks. So the most common distinction that you may have heard of, if you're a founder and you've raised before, you may have heard of common stock versus preferred stock. And that's a very classic distinction. Common stock are just the most basic ordinary stock in the company, and they are usually the type of stock that founders would hold. Preferred stock or preferred shares are a specific type of shares typically granted to investors that include certain preferred rights, usually liquidation preferences. So what we mean by that is that if there is a liquidation event, they would get their investment back before other stockholders who hold common stock. To add an additional layer here, we're just going to give an additional distinction between voting stock or voting shares and non-voting stock. It's important to know that usually the shares that are granted under ESOP are going to be non-voting stock. So if you're thinking about the type of stock that is going to be offered, the type of stock that is being granted, you're going to think of an ordinary or common non-voting stock. And these are typically the types that are reserved for ESOP. So for you to think about, putting together your ESOP plan, because we always say this, it's very important to have excellent advisors on board to be able to structure things very efficiently and make sure your corporate structure makes sense, make sure that, your legal documents are reflecting what you actually want them to reflect. There aren't any loopholes or any unpleasant surprises you haven't thought of. It's very important to have proper tax advisors on board, but it's also extremely important for you as a founder to understand exactly what you're doing, the purpose for you doing it, and making sure that you ask a lot of questions in order to be able to achieve that. So the first question you're going to want to think of is going to be related to the type of shares. What type of shares do I want to offer these employees? So I want to reward the employees that joined my business early on, the ones that are very instrumental to my success. So we offered the distinction here between ordinary shares and preferred shares. It's important for you to understand which one you want. As we mentioned, the most common one is going to be non-voting common stock under ESOP, but it's also something for you to think about. The second thing you're going to think about is going to be the secondary sale. So for you to understand if basically your employees are going to be allowed to sell these options within a certain period or not. Let's break these down concept by concept so we make it a little bit easier. So an employee share option is the right to acquire shares in a company usually the employing company, or a member of the same group at a preset price known as the exercise price. So here again, we are referencing employees, and we're emphasizing on the fact that ESOP is usually granted to employees in the company, typically the ones that are instrumental to the success or the ones that have joined the business early on. And we're talking about the company or the legal entity that we've referenced at the beginning of the session. When we're talking about the employing company or a member of the same group, here it's a technical distinction, because as your business starts to grow, and even though you often start with one company only, you may want to incorporate different entities in different jurisdictions in which you are operating, right? And the most basic distinction that we offer between these types of entities is the difference between an operational company or an OpCo and the difference between a parent company. We also refer to it as a holding company or a holdco. So let's imagine a scenario where I have a business, in tech that I've incorporated in Delaware, and this business is operating, let's say, in the UAE, and it's operating in Egypt, for example, and I have operational companies in these two countries. I'm going to have two operational companies at the lower level linked to a holding company at the higher level. Now, usually, ESOP allows you to access shares in the company in which you are employed. But take the example of an employee that is employed with the Egyptian company, for example. It's probably in their best benefit to be getting shares in the parent company, which is sitting on top. And that's why we're talking about a member of the same group. So it's either with, the company that is employing this particular employee that is granting them this incentive, or in certain other cases, it can be linked to the holding company, which is the company that is going to be sitting on top, where the shareholders sit, including founders, investors, advisors, and it's where the intellectual property of the company is going to be held. So here we're talking about a preset price, which is the exercise price. And that's a very important element that sits at the core of ESOP. And it's basically what makes it so advantageous. So here we're talking about this exercise price. Within the ESOP documents that we're going to break down, there is always reference to an exercise price, which is the price at which the employee can basically exercise this option. Normally, the exercise price is going to be the market value at the time the shares are granted. But sometimes it can be less, and sometimes it can be the par value, the nominal value, which is either going to be $1 or even less than $1. Now, you might be thinking, what's the benefit for the employee if I'm giving them the option to access the shares at their market price today? As we mentioned at the very beginning of the session, the main reason we're doing all of this is to align the interest of the shareholders with that of the employees. So think of it this way. If today I have a company that is valued at $2 million, and I'm granting one of my employees, options at the fair market value price. So you're going to divide the number of shares that they got by that number, and then you get the market price that they're going to be exercising with. However, upon exit, because usually ESOP becomes beneficial to the employee at the event of an exit in most cases. At exit, the value of the company is $20 million. So keep that in mind. It was $2 million at the very beginning. Now it's 20 at exit. The employee is going to have that amazing advantage to exercise that option at the price that was set of the valuation of 2 million, and basically get all the benefit from all the value that was added to the company throughout these years. So an employee stock option scheme is one of the legal documents that are required whenever we're setting up an ESOP strategy. So whenever we're setting up the strategy, we're going to think about different types of legal documents. The first one is going to be the scheme itself, which is going to be the plan that outlines certain things related to the contractual terms of the options. Think of it as a rule book, right? So think of it as, this is the framework of everything. These are the conditions, this sets which kind of employees can benefit from this, how they get to exercise these rights. And these are just a few of the items that are covered. So the first one is going to be, when can the company grant these options? These need to be regulated, because even though they are issued within a certain framework by the board, you also need to give them a very clear framework. Which employees can be granted options? So who are the employees that are actually going to be able to qualify? Are there any limits on the number of shares over which the options can be? any specific restrictions? All of these are questions that you want to define the answer to before you put this plan together. And how the exercise price is determined. So we referenced the fair market value. We've also referenced the nominal value, which is the par value, which is going to be less. We've mentioned options where employees don't need to pay anything at all. And these are all things you need to be very clear about. Keep in mind that if you're just, adopting some kind of an ESOP scheme that doesn't include any of these, you're basically not granting your employees anything at the time being, and it's really going to be fluid and vague. And in terms of, legal structuring and legal provisions, we always try to stay away from ambiguity as much as possible, because that's basically how problems can occur in the future. More items that we're going to cover in these schemes are going to be, are there any service or performance conditions on the option? When can the option holders exercise these options? What happens if somebody leaves? And what happens if there is an event of change of control? Let's break these down a little bit one by one, just to make things easier. So the first one is going to be related to service or performance. We've mentioned at the very beginning, concept that you're going to hear across the board if you're operating in a startup environment, which is going to be share vesting. To simplify it to the fullest degree possible, the concept of share vesting is basically vesting the shares over a specific period. What it means is I have 100 shares in the company that were granted to me, and they vest over a certain period of time, let's say 4 years, because that's going to be the typical one. I don't get my 100 shares today, but I get them if I complete these 4 years within the company. Usually, another term that you're going to hear alongside share vesting is going to be a cliff period. So the cliff period, think of it this way. The same way we think about an actual cliff, right? This vesting period is not going to start until you actually get at the top of the cliff. Once you get here, once this cliff period is done, this is when your shares will begin to vest. The most common one is going to be a cliff period of 1 year. So nothing happens before a year. If the person leaves before a year, it's like they got nothing at all, because the vesting hasn't actually started. And the most vesting terms will include probably a 4-year period. So with the 1 year, within 4 years, the shares would have vested. Another type of vesting would be one that is linked to performance. So if the employee performs certain types of obligations and reaches certain indexes, this is when the vesting takes place. However, keep in mind that this is a little bit less common, and the one that we see more frequently is just going to be the one that is linked to time. That's probably because of the challenges that are related to quantifying performance. You don't want it to be too subjective. You don't want it just to be, linked to the opinion of the founders of the company. And this is why, as a guarantee, it's usually linked to a specific period of time. Now, the main reason for adding a cliff period, the cliff that we've referenced here, is going to be to make sure that this employee that you're bringing on board, this amazing talent that you're bringing on board, needs to stay there for a specific period of time for the company to really start to feel the impact and benefit from the rewards of having them join. And this is why we add a cliff period. It's to showcase commitment. It's to show how much this employee is really tied into the company, because we keep mentioning this over and over. It's instrumental to the success, to align the interests of everyone. And the vesting period is just going to be a period to allow everything to play out and for the good consequences to basically start showing results. The second one we're talking about is, when can the option holders exercise these options? Usually these options are going to be exercised within a certain exit. Right? So if the startup is being sold, you remember when we talked about the valuation that started initially at $2 million that jumped all the way to $20 million, it's at that point, it's at that exit event that usually these options are exercised. And that's because it's in the benefit of the employee to exercise them at that specific point. The third one is going to be, what happens if an option holder leaves the company? And this is a very important topic to cover, not only for ESOP, but also for founders, for basically anyone who's holding stock in the company who is not an investor. The most typical distinction that we make is going to be the one between a good leaver and a bad leaver. To simplify it to the maximum extent, as the name indicates, a good leaver is somebody who's leaving the company on good terms for a good reason. either, I don't know, they're relocating, whatever good reason they have not to be linked to the company anymore. And a bad leaver is going to be somebody who's leaving the company on bad terms, who's causing some kind of harm or damage to the company. We always offer this distinction between a good leaver and a bad leaver. And what happens to the options is going to vary depending on whether the employee who has left as a good leaver or a bad leaver. This can either be linked to the company reacquiring the option that was granted, reclaiming certain shares in specific cases, but also to the price that will be offered to reclaim those shares. So be it a nominal price, or be it the fair market value of the stock. Then what happens if there's a change of control? In case the company, is sold, in case there is an exit, before all of this has happened, before the cliff period ends, before the vesting period has ended, what's going to happen? We typically reference what we call an event of acceleration here, or a trigger event. And in this case, typically, everything is going to be triggered and the vesting schedule is going to be accelerated. Keep in mind that these are just concepts that we've put together based on best practice, based on what we've seen successful founders do throughout the years. But this is going to be your company and your business ultimately. So you do want to tailor them to, whatever you have in mind here. So common features and common wording. We talked about common features. We're going to get a little bit more technical and just offer a bit of technical insight into what you can expect to see in an actual scheme. The most important clause is going to be that related to the granting of the option itself. So here you can see the wording that is actually taken from an actual legal text. It says that on the date of entering into force of this agreement, and we identify the year, the month, and the day, the company grants the participant being the employee that is going to be benefiting from this option, an option to purchase the total number of shares, and you have to mention the number explicitly, and you also have to mention the type specifically. For the purpose of this example, I'm just going to say 100 non-voting common stock, okay? Here there's shares, so it would be non-voting common shares of the company as set forth, the option shares, against the payment of the exercise price per share, which is the strike price that we were referencing at the very beginning of the session. And you have to identify what that price is going to be. During the exercise period commencing on X date until that date, subject to the terms and conditions of this agreement. One thing that we get asked a lot is dilution, because founders always have this concern of, what's going to happen to my shares? What's going to happen to these ESOP shares? Are they going to dilute in case I have an investor on board? And I think that the most common reason for all of this confusion is basically confusing the number of shares along with the percentage of shares. So think of it this way. If I were granted 100 shares under this wording, the one that's in front of you right now, I got 100 non-voting shares. And the company issues new shares, either because it's raising capital, either because it's restructuring, or for whatever other reason, the number is never going to change. I will always have these 100 shares. What will change, however, is going to be the percentage. And the percentage is calculated according to the number that I actually hold divided on the entire pool that the company has issued. So naturally, if this pool becomes larger, my percentage is going to be less. And this concept of dilution is something you can apply whenever you're thinking not only about ESOP, but founder shares, investor shares. And this is why percentages change, and we showcase them in a document that is referred to as the cap table. Another common wording that we're going to add here is basically explaining how the option is going to be exercised. So here we're saying that it cannot be exercised up until a certain period of time, which is going to be the anniversary date. And then we're talking about how they will vest throughout the first year after the date of grant, and shall only start vesting under the condition that the participant has continued to be in the employment of the company. After the first year, the option will vest. Here, it's vesting on a calendar basis, right? So we've talked about the cliff period. The cliff period is going to be the initial period before which nothing is going to happen. So here we mentioned it as being 1 year after the anniversary date. So if they signed it today, the cliff period is in 1 year, nothing happens up until a year from today. Then if it's vesting over a period of 4 years, for example, it will either vest monthly, quarterly, or yearly. What this basically means is that either you're going to divide this total number on month, right? And at the end or the beginning of every month, depending on how you've defined it, they will get a specific number that has already vested. Quarterly and yearly are basically the same concepts that are going to apply in these different cases. A few things to keep in mind as well before we jump to the next section are going to be the following. So we talked about the types of shares. We mentioned that the most common one is going to be the non-voting common stock that is offered under ESOP. We mentioned the secondary sale. So you always want to think about, do I want to allow somebody else to acquire this option from this employee, or do I want to reserve it to the company? And this is very important. We also talked about the distinction between leavers, what happens if an employee leaves, whether they're a good leaver or whether they're a bad leaver. And then we talked about the liquidity event, which is basically when, the employee is going to be able to benefit from this. To simplify it, when we talk about ESOP, think of it this way. We're talking about a pool in which all of these shares are lying. And whenever you have exceptional talent in the company, you're going to handpick, a few shares from this pool, and you're going to take it out and you're going to grant them the option. Something else to keep in mind is that in case you're wondering why we're referencing an option and we're not talking about shares right away, is because of the following. So think of it this way. The main reason you're granting these incentives is, I know I've said this too many times, to align the interests of the employees and the shareholders, okay? The main benefit for the employee is going to be when the company exits. So they've managed to lock in this amazing price, which is the strike price, and they're going to be able to leverage the difference between this price and the price at which the company is exiting. They're going to be able to benefit from all the discrepancy that's going to be lying in between. Since these stocks are normally non-voting stock, the employee doesn't really care a lot about the benefits that would come from either sitting on a board, because they wouldn't be allowed to do that, not be able to vote within the resolutions of the company. What they care about most is going to be the benefit. And the reason why they come under the form of an option is because there are certain ways to tax shares depending on the jurisdictions in which you're operating, and not to overwhelm with the employee with having to, understand these burdens, understanding how to deal with them. This is why you grant them the option to exercise it later on. So instead of me being granted an option at, let's say, $100 and having to pay the company $100 today, or to make the example a bit more significant, having to pay $20,000 today, I'm not going to pay anything today, but I will benefit from an option in case these 20,000 become now worth 1 million, and I will just get the discrepancy that sits between these two. Now, to implement these incentives that you're granting to your employees from this pool that we've just referenced, you need a number of legal documents. So we talked about the scheme, and then we're going to talk about there's the option itself. So there's the option agreement under which these shares are actually granted. But there are also different things that you need to think of. Whenever a company is issuing these kinds of options, whenever the company is making a big decision that is not related to the day-to-day management of the company, you always want to think about corporate governance. You always want to think about best practice. So the board of directors of the company, which is basically the managers of the company, the management vehicle of the company, let's say, is going to adopt a resolution initially in which they approve the scheme. So the first thing we talked about is the scheme itself, which is the set of, here it is, the contractual terms of the option, right? So the framework that we've mentioned, we put that together. Next, that needs to be approved by the board of directors of the company. Then you have the option agreement themselves, and typically you would even have the shareholders of the company approving these options. So we've talked about the common wording, the common language, and here we're just going to highlight the concept of ESOP very quickly in 2 or 3 different jurisdictions. So as you know, Delaware is the most popular jurisdiction for startups and technology companies, and that's for a number of reasons related to efficiency, related to cost, related to how advanced the corporate legal structure is, how advanced the corporate courts are. And basically every major technology company would have its parent company sitting in Delaware for all of these reasons. You do have ESOPs that are being regulated in different jurisdictions more and more, and that are trying to offer a framework. In the UAE, for example, we started to notice that there is a little bit of improvement, a little bit of new legislation that is coming into place, but keep in mind that those are usually reserved for publicly listed companies. And in all of our examples now, we were talking about private companies. So as you can see here, we've referenced the law itself in case you want to learn more about it. If not, and you're operating out of a Delaware C Corp, which is the most common type of vehicle that you would have as a technology company, this would operate under a different framework. So now just to give you an insight on how you can basically put all of this together. In case you haven't signed up to your Lexyom dashboard, make sure to do so. You can see the link here. We can send you the link. We're also going to be sharing some material after this session just to give you a bit more of a practical hands-on feel. Once you've accessed your Lexyom dashboard, you can access the create a contract section. You can create these documents that we're referencing. They're very easy to complete. You just complete your information and it can customize to the agreement itself. You can also visit the Lexyom Academy to learn more about share vesting, to learn more about the cliff period, not only about ESOP, but other things that we've mentioned as well. So we're keeping this as practicable as possible. Thank you very much for your attention. I know